My friends, how are you doing today? I'm going to be talking about Chapter 9 in our building construction textbook on ordinary construction. And I'm going to take a little different approach this time. I want to talk more about the tactical considerations than the construction itself. You can read that. We are blessed with a number of PowerPoint slides that cover that information. So I guess it's one thing to know about this type of construction or any other type of construction. But to me, it's the implications for us as firefighters and incident commanders as officers that we need to really understand what it means when we read these things. So ordinary construction is that type, let me get it right, type 3 construction. We've already talked about our wood frame construction. We've talked about heavy timber. This is type 3 ordinary construction. It used to be considered simply brick and wood joist type of construction. If we look at a brick building, we cannot say that that's ordinary construction. We can't even say if it's real brick or not. There's brick veneer today. So when we look at ordinary construction, it uses a variety of products for it's the walls and the roof and the construction part. But the common characteristic is that the exterior walls are masonry. The book gives a good example on strip malls that are made with lightweight wood roof trusses and concrete block walls. That is type 3 or ordinary construction. So I think that sometimes it's a little misleading when we talk about ordinary construction because we think it's more fire safe than perhaps, or more stable. Let me put it that way. It's more stable than perhaps other types of construction or wood frame otherwise. But truth be known, a lot of what is a part of ordinary construction is wood and framing, wood joists and those kinds of things. So when we think about, and I'm jumping to the very back here, your book goes into a lot of concerns and comments and different kinds of loads and things like that. But when we think about ordinary construction, that brick masonry, non-combustible material on the exterior, interior's wood, it is mostly like I said, you see it in some retail establishment, apartment buildings, department stores. And when we think of the fire load in those buildings is mainly the contents of the building. The combustible material, the wood stripping, the cross bridging, wood joists, 2x4 wood studs, even that is enough to have a tremendous fire load for, a building that's unoccupied or not completed. One of the biggest problems with ordinary construction is void spaces, the void between the roof and the highest ceiling and the roof, other voids that may exist there as well. Ordinary construction's been around for a while, and that's not always a good thing because a lot of these buildings have deteriorated, they're falling down, they're in disrepair, and so it may be that they are not, your book references 15 minutes is an accepted safe operational period when we're talking about ordinary construction. So think about that. And it, we also have to think about, is that 15 minutes after the fire starts, 15 minutes after arrival, or what exactly is it? So that's not very long, and no matter how you look at it. Interior, when interior walls start to fall, what does that mean? That the exterior is on its way, and certainly the roof. The exterior walls become less stable and more prone to collapse. The biggest problem with ordinary construction, the spread of smoke and fire through concealed spaces. as we talked about those void spaces, and your book references a lot of those. The most serious is that common cockle-off between the highest ceiling and the roof. And so it could be, I'm not going to call it an attic as such, but it is an area where, especially in apartment buildings, unless there's fire stopping between apartments or a section of the building, it can run that whole area under the roof, and you might not ever know it. So we see this happen all the time, and so that's why we have vertical ventilation is important. Just remember that that acts like a chimney. So when we vertically ventilate, we have to be prepared for that. And sometimes vertical ventilation is harder, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because it means putting somebody on the roof. And is that always the wisest thing that we want to think about doing? Your book says, and I thought this was a very interesting statistic, it doesn't really cite its source, that more firefighters have been killed in fires in ordinary construction than in any other type of construction. Now, when you think about the fact that there's more residential fires than anything, that probably means 1 and 2 family dwellings. I was shocked at that statistic. That surprised me a little bit. There's a variety of reasons, and one of them is it says that these buildings are old. They're over 100 years old. That people are not, people, they don't want to tear down these old buildings, but they fall into disrepair, and they're vacant, and that is what makes them more hazardous, perhaps. Many times it's all about keeping the storefront looking good, so it looks good from the outside. You never know what's on the inside. And also, as somebody brought up in our virtual class, that many of these now have there's apartments above them, these loft apartments that are so popular, with storefront down below. So it really does make it makes for a hazardous situation. Fire safety is not usually a priority when we talk about building preservation, especially if you've got historical preservation people involved in this process. It's not going to be a friendly process at all. We want to make sure a proactive approach is that you stay on top of these renovations within your first due, within your community. You can make recommendations, you can ask questions, and all of this will enable you to better respond if there's a fire at this particular structure. Making sure, again, that you stay alert to alterations or just renovations that are being made in these areas. The book talks about, under tactical considerations, that when it's time for firefighters to immediately evacuate the building, the department should have a recognizable signal. And this is something that I hope we've done enough, and I say we as in the fire service, have done enough with calling the Mayday, with evacuation sounds. What do we use? Most of the time it's some sort of a horn, three long sounds on the federal cue, or one it references here in your book that I'm trying to think what they use, the electronic siren, the wail and yelp are used only for building evacuation. And it makes a great point that Brannigan, it quotes Brannigan again as saying that many times he saw firefighters looking back, and it's I would guess it's to make sure that you're going to make it out, or to see what's coming behind you, or to make sure that the rest of your crew is with you. But he says, don't look back, look where you're going, so you don't trip, fall, run into stuff. You need to look forward, look where you're going, don't look back. And we don't want to stop for anything. When that is sounded, get out, do not stop for anything. A lot of times, ordinary construction, another tactical consideration, ordinary construction is used in different processes where they may be, like your book mentions food processing, where there may be a concrete floor as the second floor, and it's required that way for safety, health reasons, food safety. And so that added weight inside the building, we may not recognize that. And so again, we may not know a lot of these things. A wall collapse must be in the forefront of your mind. I was with City of LaGrange Fire Department, and back in the 90s, we had a large building. It was an old bank in the downtown district, like right on the square, that at the time was a furniture company. And they had pre-planned that building and pre-planned that building, thank goodness. It had brick veneer, it had a false front, there were so many problems with that building, but they had pre-planned it. But when it did catch on fire and everybody was there was one firefighter that barely missed the collapse of the front wall. They licked him on the heels. Those bricks that were so close. He remembers it too. He recently retired and he talked about it. So we have to always be aware of the potential of a wall collapse. Your book mentions the problem with alleyways, and that's why you don't want to be in the alley with this type of construction fighting fire. It's not a good place to be. You may be able to use, if you're trying to, the only reason that you would want to try to do something like this is to save exposures. But if you can be on the roof of the exposure, direct the water hose down to act like a water curtain, or do it from the alleyway, or use your aerial to flow from above. Don't put people in the alley. Don't put people in the alley. That is just not a safe thing. Once you have a wall collapse, the building is given up. The building says, I'm done. And you should be too. Once you have a wall collapse, you're not saving anything. The fire is spreading. It's not worth firefighters getting injured. You need to evacuate and regroup. Know the collapse indicators. I think that's another important thing for firefighters and incident commanders and others on scene. Bricks can be pretty tough, but they're not all made great. And especially when you think about older bricks, the crumbling effect, they can crumble, they absorb moisture, and they can fail. When a wall breaks at the ground level and falls straight out, that's one of the worst you can have. So again, we want to think about that when we think about establishing a collapse zone. And that's another thing that the book talks about. There should be a collapse zone that you have established. And it even talked about using uncharged hose line to mark that collapse zone, that you don't get inside of that. And when you think that bricks can fly at 1.5 times the length of the height of the building, it's pretty tall. Yeah, it's pretty far. It's pretty far. Make sure that you have a limited number of people in that collapse zone. Or if you have to have people operating in the collapse zone, there should be a minimum number of people. And again, marking that off. If we use straight streams on a brick building, on the side of the brick building, what's going to happen? It's going to beat those bricks down. It's going to lessen their strength. It's going to cause them to fail more often. If you have to breach a wall for some reason, think about what you're doing. Think about why you're doing it, and is this really the right thing to do? Don't cut a straight line across the top, because it's going to be harder to handle that, and it affects the integrity of that wall, of that brick wall, certainly. Think about when you're at these buildings, what kind of overhang do they have in front? Think about theaters, hotels, old buildings like that. Do they have some sort of a brick cornice? I think that's the right term, overhang type of thing over the sidewalk, over the main entrance. Try not to use those, because it's just waiting to come down is the bottom line. We want to make sure that, if we have buildings in our community, even though we may not have a fire like this, we can learn from other places that do experience these fires. And so we want to make sure that we have good knowledge about these buildings. and walls that are deteriorated, walls that are braced, tied, propped up in any kind of way. That's a bad sign. And we want to make sure that we treat it as such. Remember, we risk a lot to save a lot. Risk a lot to save a lot. A lot of times, the amount of fire gives you a lot of clues about how much longer the building is going to stand or be stable, or at least semi-stable. Firefighters should not be working on the roof. Again, we talked about if you have to do vertical ventilation, you can use, make sure you use that aerial. Make sure you, especially if you have a bucket or, a tower type truck where you could set it down. You don't want to bang it on the roof because then the roof is going to come in. But if you can lower it enough that your firefighters can then cut that hole, again, operating on the roof is a very tricky thing in any fire. And many of these tactical considerations apply to any type of fire, but especially ordinary type construction. You've got to make sure the roof is good to use. If you're going to do that vertical ventilation, like I said, you don't want firefighters operating up there. Collapsing roofs are going to bring down walls. Remember that. If the roof is starting to collapse, the walls are going to come down too. Just be prepared for it. Again, if this is happening at a structure, ask yourself that question: what are we doing? What kind of good are we doing? Are we making a big show of it, or what are we doing? I was reading something in one of the other courses, and I can't remember exactly where I was reading it, but it was kind of like somebody asked, said, "What are you doing?" And they were doing something unsafe, and he's like, "I got to make it look good. The mayor's across the street." Well, you know what? If it's that important, then bring the mayor over and you explain to him what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if the mayor's any kind of an individual, they will certainly understand what that means. One of the things about pre-planning is more seasoned firefighters that have seen this type of construction before. Make sure that those younger firefighters, those newer firefighters know about it. Like I say, that bank building in LaGrange, everybody knew. We all knew about that bank building. It had been a bank, and then it was empty for a long time, I believe. And then this furniture store went in there. And but we all knew about it. We all knew the dangers. They had pre-planned, like I said, and pre-planned and pre-planned. So, fire takes the path of least resistance. Make sure that you're using your PPV in the proper way. Even if it's certainly, you can use the blowers or just even pressurize. You put a hose line and use a hose line that way. One of the things that this book brings up is talks about fire doors. And I would bet that we'll hear some more about this and other types of construction. But, and again, I think about my own experience. And this was in an old mill that burned, and there were roll-up fire doors that failed in the fire, which was probably a good thing because it might have trapped firefighters. We were kind of old school, doing it old school then. We know so much more now than we did then. But it talks about making sure that there's any kind of fire doors that you prop them open, that whether they're roll down doors or even, the latch doors, regular, personnel doors, that you prop those open in some way and that you try to keep that pathway clear so that you have that means of escape. Never pass through a sliding or overhead rolling door without blocking it open. I'm trying to think. This one had sliding doors. There may have been some roll-up doors in there, but the more I think about it, these were sliding door, supposed to be automatic fire doors. So again, you're pre-planning in your walkthroughs. A lot of times we're not looking at those things, and we're planning how, we would address a fire in this building. Think about it from your own personal safety as well in these older type of buildings that may have some of these automatic doors. Your book references a building in Rochester, New York, where the overhead rolling fire door is concealed in the ceiling. And you would never know it was there if you hadn't have pre-planned. A door like this may activate after a sudden burst of heat, and it could certainly come down on your hose line and act like a big old hose clamp, and then you would be in trouble. So make sure you wedge those things open. Make sure you know where they are. If a building is big enough to activate the fire door, especially one of these large rolling fire doors, whether it's up and down or sideways, then think about what you're doing. What are we really saving by being inside there? We know that waiting is not something that firefighters do very well, and it's really hard to be the one that's in the adjacent structure waiting, protecting exposures. Let's put it that way. That is a very hard thing to do. And your book tells a story about how they decided they weren't going to wait anymore, and they opened the fire door, and it was so intense that they could not tolerate the thermal heat. They were forced to back out, and the fire extended into the exposure building. So do your job, even if it's really hard to sit there and do nothing. That you're doing something by doing your assignment. We talked about alleyways. One thing too I'll mention too is think about when we're talking about ordinary construction, think about chimneys, other chases that may not come all the way down. We talk about HVAC systems that are on a roof and that the load that might have. Well, in this brick construction, this use of bricks, you may find chimneys that are hanging chimneys, as they're called, and other types of chases or fixtures, vertical fixtures or parts of the building that could always be a damage as well. Tabletop drills. I like what your book says about those. They've all been they're very effective because you get this bird's eye view of what's going on the scene. But as he says, if you put your chin on the table and you're looking at it from the front, you don't get the same view. And so incident command has to know what they're doing. A lot of times, incident command may be run from a vehicle, maybe run from inside a vehicle where it's calmer and there's less distraction. But maybe sometimes you might want to try the roof of an adjacent structure so that it does give you that bird's eye view. I think that's a great piece of advice that we oftentimes, all we can see is from ground level across. We don't think about getting up there. Your book references using news cameras. If you've got helicopters flying above, use them. We don't like them being there, but let's put them to good work. Send us that feed of what you see. Tell us what you see. And that way it does help us have a better view of what is going on. So those are just some tactical considerations that are listed in your book. They start on page 272 and go through 277. There's 45 of them. Things to think about. And like I said, a lot of these are repeated through the different types of construction. But I think that ordinary construction is one that a lot of times we see it at the middle of the road. When we look at type 1 as non-combustible, and we go all the way to type 5, which is wood frame. And so we think that 3, which is what this is, it's like kind of in the middle. It's not so bad as wood frame, but it's not as great. So we may tend to let our defenses down a little bit and keep in mind what we're doing. A lot of these buildings, that particular building, it's a parking lot. Yes, it's a parking lot. That bank building in LaGrange. It's a park. They turned it into a parking lot, and that's okay. That was okay because no one was injured. Came pretty close. Nobody got injured and or killed. And that's the name of the game. That's what it's all about. So as you read through this, I'm going to put this video on the website to read it, to look at it after you've done your reading. If you want to look at it before, you can do that too. It's too late now. But think about these things. Think about what you've read or you're reading and how they affect your strategies. Think about how they affect your pre-planning, about your knowledge of your first due or your community. Think about what you can share with others from a training standpoint, and making sure, like I say, that making sure that everybody's aware that this is the building that's going to go, and we're not going to let anything bad happen there. Maybe it won't go, but chances are, if you feel that way, it might. So thanks so much. Be safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.